Hi, my name is Janice Lee. I'm a realtor in San Francisco Bay Area. I will be the host for the English session today. The Cantonese session will begin at 5 p.m. 廣東話嗰個講座咧會5點鐘先開始。So our speaker today is Aaron Wu, a Bay Area native who graduated from Golden Gate University Law. His areas of expertise includes estate planning, business structuring, and real estate law. In his spare time, you will find him reading or cycling through the peninsula. Today's session, the goal is to provide information about Prop 19, the pros and cons of doing something prior to February 15th, the ramifications of doing nothing, and the potential remedies to Prop 19. Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about Prop 19 or any background information that you can provide so our attendees can learn a little bit more about Prop 19?
It sounds great. Here we go. Okay, everyone. So just to make sure that I don't get dropped off or anything, I'm going to turn off my camera for a sec as we do this presentation, but towards the end, I will turn my camera back on, right, just to make sure I don't have any latency issues. So first off, thank you, Janice, and also Victoria as well for hosting Andy and I today. We'll be talking to everyone here about Proposition 19. Proposition 19, so today, there are several things that one should consider as it relates to Proposition 19. The first part is just your the 3 levels of tax that are associated with your potential property or multiple properties, the proposition itself, the 2 parts of it, the Proposition 19 remedies, as well as any future property purchase considerations. Now, this is a disclaimer. So we are not, like our firm, Lee and Wu, we are not your attorneys. This is for general discussion only and is not meant to be a substitute for legal advice. Please speak to your own professional service provider before taking any actions. Also, for those that are attending this, we hope that you gain something from this. However, this is something I really want to point out, is that this presentation covers just a broad approach to Proposition 19. The properties that you may hold could have potential solutions that may fit your situation. However, there are many different conditions associated with every single piece of property that we've come across. So not every solution works in the same manner. So if you're here to learn more about Proposition 19 as a whole, that's what we'll go through. But if it's related to, like, how does it tie specifically to my property or to your property, that's going to be a bit, that will require a bit more of an analysis well, I'd recommend that you reach out to your professional service provider to work with them on. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 tax considerations when it comes to the impact of Prop 19. The first is income tax. So I'm speaking specifically towards one's capital gains and the potential step up in basis for a property that one owns. Quick summary is that when one buys a property and it goes up in value, there could potentially be capital gains associated with that increase in value. And when a person passes away, typically those gains, if their child or any person that they distribute it to via an inheritance would receive a step up in basis. Okay, so that's the first consideration, is the income tax associated with your capital gains. Second is the property tax, or that's associated potentially with the gift of a potential property. Now, Proposition 19 impacts other propositions that had come before it, which are Proposition 13, 58, and 193. And also, what's important with this is Proposition 19 directly impacts property tax and is reliant upon the effective date of transfer. Okay, we'll come back to that shortly. And finally, the third consideration is for state tax. On the federal level, there's an $11.7 million exemption amount that each individual may pass off to whoever it may be from their estate. If you go above $11.7 million as an individual, then you will be taxed on the federal level. But on the California state level, we do not have an estate tax. So, as I mentioned earlier, the laws that impact one's property in terms of income are the capital gains. So, if you hold a property for longer than a year, then your property may be treated as a long-term asset, which would subject it to a 15 to 20% tax on the federal level. And again, that requires for you to hold it for at least a year. Now, if you hold a property for less than a year and you were to sell the property, you'd be taxed at the ordinary income tax rate that you fall into. The capital gain exemption. So if you were to hold your property as your primary residence and you own the property for 2 out of the past 5 years, you as an individual can claim a $250,000 exemption amount or a $500,000 exemption amount towards any capital gain that you have on that property. And finally, the step up in basis that I had referred to earlier is under code section 1014, which allows for a property that's inherited by beneficiaries for you to receive a step up in basis for that amount of or for that income there. So essentially, if one were to inherit a property, let's say from their parents, and there was a capital gain, potential capital gain liability of $1 million, but they receive the property from their parents or from a parent when they pass away, and the property receives a step up in basis, well, that $1 million in terms of potential tax liability would essentially be zeroed out to the fair market value. And one more thing, in community property, community property is owned by a couple. I guess a full 100% step up in basis at the death of one of the spouses. So I mentioned there are 3 other laws plus the change in ownership that are affected by Proposition 19. Proposition 13 came in the 70s, and this really, the purpose of this was to create a reliable way of calculating property tax. And in order to calculate property tax, what they would do is that they'd take the purchase price of the property and tax it at approximately a 1% of that on an annual basis. Now, that's not including local county fees or city fees that may be passed on from different propositions, but in general, it's 1% of the original purchase value of the property. And as the years go by, or every year, the maximum amount that your property tax can increase is 2% per year. In terms of it's very important to understand that assessed value for property tax is different than market value. Assessed value, as I mentioned earlier, can only increase 2% per year, but your fair market value, for those that are in the Bay Area, you see fair market values increasing by 5%, possibly 7% a year. So over time, the values in property have far exceeded the fair market value has grown at a much faster rate than the assessed value. So today there are a lot of properties that has a huge disparity between assessed value versus market value. Now, the term change in ownership is really important because whenever there is a purchase or sale, gift, death, or any type of transfer created by operation of law, that automatically creates a need to have a reassessment for that property. All right. Now, that reassessment automatically occurs unless you can show that there's an exemption that exists. So Proposition 58 and Proposition 193 effectively do somewhat the same thing, but they're just between either parents and children or grandparents and grandchildren. So what Proposition 58 established is that for primary residence transfers between parents and children, whether it goes from the parent or child, whichever way it goes, there's an unlimited amount that you can transfer in terms of your assessed property value. So you can transfer it at any point, whether it's via death, via while you're alive, you can transfer it and there won't be any issues in terms of the property tax reassessment.
So Aaron, this is only applicable prior to February 15th now because of Prop 19, right?
Yes, exactly. It is only applicable before Prop 19 comes into existence. And so this is what goes away February 16th. And this is why it is very important to understand what people could do now versus what people may not be able to do in the future. Yeah. So as I was saying, Prop 58 allows for primary residence transfers of an unlimited amount of value to be transferred between parent and child. For other property, parents and children could pass $1 million of assessed value to one another. Okay, assessed value, that's as I mentioned earlier, is different from fair market value. So if your property that's worth on the market $3 million today, but is assessed at $500,000, well, when you pass this property from either parent or child, the impact there would only be that $500,000 amount of assessed value. And Prop 193 just allows for this to happen between grandparents and grandchildren, so long as the parents are deceased, or there's no parents in between. Now, Prop 19, there are two parts to it. The first part we're going to go over pretty quickly because a majority of the issues that have been brought up to us is caused by part 2. So the first part, this is for those that are 55 years of age or older. Prop 19 enables people that are above the age of 55 years old to be, or those that have experienced natural disasters that have created a loss in fair market value by 50% against their properties. They can transfer their property tax to another property that they purchased. So they'd effectively have to sell their home and move to another property, and they can carry over their property tax with them.
I also want to mention that related to this, you can actually buy something more expensive than what you sell your property for. Previously, prior to Prop 19, you were unable to do that. So if you have a property that you sell for $1 million, if you buy something for 1.5, you'll get the property tax base for the first 1 million, and then the additional 500,000 would be based on the market value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly, Janice. And the other thing is also before Prop 19, you could only do that transfer one time. And it had to be of equal or lesser value. But after Prop 19, you can transfer your property tax up to 3 times. So you can go from house to house to house. The reporting requirement there is that you have to report it within 2 years of the purchase to transfer your property tax. And the effective date is April 1st, 2021.
When you say effective date, that means that you have to sell your property after that date and buy the new property after that date?
So it is not 100% clear in the legislation as to whether or not you'd have to sell the property and buy it between the two. There's a bit of risk associated with that. And that's That's kind of what we refer to as straddling the straddling between the deadline. If you could, I would suggest holding off on these type of transfers until after April 1st, 2021.
These transfers meaning when you're purchasing a property.
Yes.
So I just want to be clear.
The sale of the property, and then also the purchase of the property. So waiting for the two-part transaction to take place until after April 1st, 2021.
Thank you.
Now, this is a screenshot that I'm sure many of you have seen already. This is off of the Board of Equalization's website, which is the governing body that oversees the implementation of Prop 19 and all these other the associated other propositions and laws around this. And here is an example. Okay, so John and Mary, they're over 55 years old. They have their primary residence. They bought it in 2010 for $1 million. Today, the property is worth $2 million, and they've made no improvements to the property. In property taxes year 0, they're at $10,000 in terms of property tax. Property tax year 10, they're up to about $12,200 based upon 2% increases per year. And keep in mind, this is rough numbers, not including any fees associated with the counties. Their considerations, if they're thinking about moving, is that, well, they're $12,200, and this is post Prop 19 coming into effect. They can move to any property within California and carry this $12,200 property tax with them. So if they were to buy a $3 million property, that should be assessed at $30,000 a year. Or if they were to buy a $2 million property, which would be assessed at $20,000 a year, they could still carry this property tax basis with them. Now, the other consideration, if they're interested in selling, is the one that comes with capital gains. So going through this type of transaction does not avoid capital gains tax liability. Although an exemption may apply, like as I mentioned earlier, if you hold it for more than a year, then you may be able to exercise the long-term capital asset, 15 to 20% tax rates on the federal level. Or if you hold it for 2 out of the past 5 years and you live in it for 2 out of the past 5 years, then you may receive up to $250,000 capital gains exemption on it as an individual, or $500,000 as a couple.
Hi, Andrew. Hi, for 55 years old, is that, both of them need to be over 55 or the older one over?
So can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so for both, they need to be both over 55, right?
So it's not quite clear in the legislation, but I have heard from local authorities that it only requires one person to be over 55.
Okay, one person, okay.
But it has not been.
Can we hold questions? Can we hold questions to the end or type it into the chat? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Now we are going to hold questions to the end. So we're going to move to part 2 of the exclusion. So part 2 of the exclusion is the one that's really been changing. Has really prompted a lot of people to act. So before Prop 19, as mentioned earlier, if it's one's primary residence, you could take an unlimited amount of assessed value and transfer it between parent to child or grandparent to grandchild. And for any other property, you could transfer up to $1 million of assessed value, or combine $2 million per couple. Okay. Now, post Prop 19, what happens now is that a primary residence, if it's a transfer between parent to child, and it can only go one way now, if the child moves into that property as a primary residence, they will receive $1 million credit. Well, essentially $1 million credit when they evaluate. One second, I'm gonna have to mute somebody. All right. they'll effectively have this $1 million, I call it $1 million credit towards their current property assessed value. And that $1 million credit is utilized, or it's added to their current property tax value. And if that amount is less than the fair market value, then there will be an additional property tax reassessment for that difference there on top of what they're currently paying. So quickly put,
Can
$2
you
million.
provide an example?
Of course. So let's say your property tax basis is $100,000 today, and you're a parent and you live in your primary residence and you pass it off to your kid. The property is worth $1.5 million that you pass off to your kid. So your property tax again is $100,000. Fair market value is 1.5. So clearly, between fair market value and property tax, there's $1.4 million worth of difference there. The per the new regulation, $1 million will be $1 million will not be utilized or will not be assessed against you if you were to transfer it to your child and your child were to move into that property. And this transfer can occur via inheritance or also via gift. Now, the total tax liability for that example would be $500,000 total after the transfer takes effect. And that's calculated because, again, fair market value is 1.5. You subtract the $1 million credit. So now you have $500,000 of total tax liability. Okay, 500,000 at 1% is $5,000 a year.
Sorry, wouldn't
Now-
there be a subtraction for the original base, which was the 100K? So wouldn't it be?
It would be.
Mhm.
Oh, and the reason why I call it the $1 million credit is because in that example, you have 1.1, assuming you have $100,000 that you're already being taxed on, right? And the difference is 1.4. So you remove that $1 million there. So you have $400,000 of potential tax liability. So you combine the 100 plus the 400. So that's 500. Or the simpler way to do it is just take fair market value minus $1 million, and that remainder, if you receive a positive number, then that's the amount that you're going to be taxed on. If you receive a negative number, you're not going to be reassessed.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Now, if the child does not move into the property, and let's say it's the parent's primary residence and the child does not move into the property, well, there will be a full property value reassessment on the date of transfer. So in that example, $100,000, the child receives a $1.5 million property, decides not to move into it, then it's going to be assessed at $1.5 million. And that assessed value will go from $1,000 a year for property tax to 1.5, so $15,000 a year. For the other part of Prop 19 that affects property tax is that other property that is transferred, there is no longer $1 million assessed value that you can transfer of credit to any of your children anymore. So any other rental property or income property that you have will receive a full market value property tax reassessment. And then this filing requirement must occur within 1 year of the transfer, or else you'll receive the assessed value, the full assessed value. This is a breakout of the Board of Equalization's off the Board of Equalization's website. And here is an example of a parent-child transfer before Prop 19. So we have a couple that has a property that they bought for $500,000. The property is worth $2 million today, and their assessed value is approximately $900,000 or $9,000 per year. So the fair market value of this property tax would be or should be $20,000, but is currently only at $9,000. Their considerations today is if they decide to sell the property today, all right, $9,000 can be moved to select properties in certain counties. And this is pre-Prop 19. Capital gains, they still have capital gains that they'd have to worry about. Primary residence, if the parent-child transfer or grandparent to grandchild transfer occurs, If it's via inheritance, they'd maintain the step in basis, but their property and their property tax would not be reassessed. If they gifted today, they do not retain the opportunity to have the step up in basis because the basis stays the same. And by basis, I mean, when they bought the property at $500,000 and they made no improvements, their $500,000 would be their basis, foregoing, like, if there are no improvements, no depreciation, and their potential tax liability would be $1.5 million, because that's the difference between the $2 million that it's worth and the $500,000 that they bought it at. So that would be the capital gains. If they gave it via gift, that $500,000 of their basis would transfer over to the receiving party, and thus, like, their child, if they were to sell it, they themselves would be potentially liable for the $1.5 million of capital gains. But if they do so and they transfer it ahead of time, they would be able to preserve the property tax.
So what you're saying, Aaron, is if you do something now, they can preserve property tax, the current property tax. This is like meaning you do it before February 15th. But if they do something, they will lose stepped up basis, though. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, exactly. They will lose it. They will lose their step up in basis. Yes. And if it was their rental or income property today, and it's not their primary residence, and they're allowed to have up to $1 million of assessed value for non-primary property, they can transfer that over. They may lose the step up in basis depending upon how much of the income or revenue generating property they transfer, but they would also be able to preserve their property tax value. Now, just for the purposes of time, I am going to speed things up a little bit. So post Prop 19, same example, $500,000 that was purchased at, $900,000 assessed property tax value today, and they've made no improvements to the property. After Prop 19 comes in, February 16th, the considerations that the family would have is that they could move to any property, or they could sell their property and move to any property in California and take their original property tax basis with them. Now, the capital gains, again, you would be subject to capital gains tax, or if they wanted to pass it off via inheritance. Now, if they do that, the kids move in, then their property tax would be reassessed at $2 million minus the $1 million of credit. So the overall tax liability there is $10,000 approximately per year. But the step up in basis they would receive. On the other end, the kids, if they don't move in, then they would receive a full reassessment to fair market value of $20,000 per year. But they still get the step up in basis. Now, if you gift it after Prop 19 occurs, then there will be a reassessment to based upon whether or not it's your primary residence or if it's your other property. If it's your primary residence and the kid does not move in, you get the full amount reassessed. If you gift it and the kid does move in, then we would they'd only receive that $1 million worth of credit towards that primary residence. Either way, if you do that via gift, your separate basis is foregone, and that's it.
Sorry, are we allowed to ask questions, or is that towards the end?
We're going to wait for questions until the end, because
Okay.
yeah. So
Yeah.
can you, Aaron, can you give us some potential remedies? What people can do?
Yes, of course. So that's the next slide here. So there are 4 different types of remedies, and there's actually many permutations as well. And some remedies, unfortunately, no remedy is perfect. They all have issues with them. One remedy is the do nothing route. Okay, by do nothing route, these are the considerations, or these are the results that could happen. Okay, so on the income tax side, you would still be eligible for the step up in basis if you were to pass your property off to your child via inheritance. Okay, and if you do nothing with your property, and that means like you don't sell it at any point, then that $250,000 or $500,000 exemption for holding it for the past 2 out of 5 years, you would not be eligible because you never sold it. On the property tax level, okay, so it depends on the property. If you do nothing for the primary residence, it depends on who inherits that property and what they do with it. If the child moves into the property, then they get the $1 million credit towards property tax reassessment to determine whether or not the property tax will be reassessed. If they don't move into it, then the property is fully assessed. And in terms of the estate and gift tax side, that's something that also needs to be considered as well. If your estate value is above $11.7 million, then you may be impacted as well. The second route is the gift route. If you gift the property, there are considerations. Now, this is assuming a gift before February 16th. And so a part of that is the income tax. The step up in basis, you're no longer eligible because it goes out of your state and it transfers, that property transfers with its original basis to your to the recipient. The $250,000 or $500,000 in capital gains exemption, that is no longer available as well for you, but for the recipient, they could hold the property for the next 2 out of 5 years and receive that exemption. Now, the property tax okay, so in terms of property tax, now this depends on the property that's being transferred. Before February 16th, if you transfer it for primary residences to your children, there will be no property tax reassessment of any sort to your children for primary residence transfers of your primary residence to your child, okay? Other property, it depends on how much that property is worth that you transfer in terms of the property tax reassessment value. But if it stays under that $1 million of assessed value per spouse, then there would not be a reassessment either. And if you did the gift route, well, you'd have to file a gift form with the IRS, and that's Form 709. Another potential remedy, and this one is a little bit more complicated, is via entity ownership. So entities are treated differently, and depending upon the type of transfer that occurs and the current ownership that a property is being held in, that may impact, that would or may not impact the property tax reassessment and also the step up in basis associated with that property. There are a couple different different tests that the state of California has to determine whether or not property tax would be reassessed. But to go into that would take a whole new session. So I'm just going to say broadly that if you're evaluating what's happening to an entity that you hold or potentially putting a property into an entity, there are solutions there. Now, irrevocable trusts, I will briefly go over this because this is something I know people are very interested in, but I will also put out the caveat there that this is something that is very, there's a possibility that it could preserve your property tax and also your step up in basis. However, there's a lot of risks associated with it. When you set up an irrevocable trust, you have to set up a new tax identification number. It's a separate taxpayer altogether. When the property is transferred into the trust, there's an effective transfer. And for income tax purposes, it depends on the structure of the trust. You may be able to preserve your step up in basis, but it is a very complicated solution. And the other part about the irrevocable trust is that there are additional costs associated with it for an ongoing on an ongoing basis. And also you will lose, well, with an irrevocable trust, if it's a property, like an income generating property, you cannot have any financial interest in the irrevocable trust, or it depends on how it's structured. There's a potential loss of control, so you may not be able to refinance. And also there may be other issues such as due on transfer clauses that may be triggered by via your mortgage and so forth.
Just to be clear, Aaron, I
Yeah.
think there's some people asking about irrevocable trust versus revocable trust. Can you state a little bit the difference? Because most people have what we call living trust, which is a
Yeah.
revocable trust. Can you mention a little bit more about that?
Sure. A revocable trust is no different than you owning it pretty much outright yourself. There is no different tax treatment, and And in such, like because you retain control over the property, it is a part of you and is a part of your estate. Until you relinquish your control and your interest in the financial benefits of that property and move it out of your estate, it's going to be seen as in your estate. So if you had it in a revocable trust and you're going across that February 16th deadline, unfortunately, it will be treated as if it's a part of your estate and not separate from you. An irrevocable trust moves things outside of your estate, and effectively, you kind of send it off into the direction that you want it to go, and you lose a lot more control there. There are control mechanisms that can be placed, but that's much more complicated. And here's just a breakout of the four different types and the considerations. And I know we're pressed on time here, so I'm just going to skip ahead. Future considerations: just know what you're getting, who's buying it, how you're going to hold property, whether it's going to be an entity or not. Those are going to be very important. And apologies for rushing through this. I'm told that we have a hard stop deadline at 4:40 today. So if there are any questions, please email us or potentially
We could
contact
go, we probably have time for about 10 minutes of questions if
perfect.
needed. But before we go there, can we talk briefly about irrevocable? Does that mean that you no longer have control of the property? Does that mean that it's now given to whoever you give it to and you can't take it back? I think people need to be a lot more clearer about what an irrevocable trust is.
Okay, perfect. Well, if we have 10 minutes, then I can take questions. In regards to an irrevocable trust, there are many different ways that you can set them up. But yes, for the majority of them, you do relinquish a certain level of control. You can maintain a general power of appointment to be able to potentially to change who receives the asset in the future, which could, you're riding a very thin line between how the IRS classifies property versus how a change in how the state classifies the transfer of ownership. So like the property tax law versus the federal tax law. But there is a way, however, once you do so, again, you cannot have any financial benefits from it. You cannot have any financial benefit from the property, and also like the ability to refinance and so forth. That all will be subject to either it may not even be available to you anymore, or it could be available on a very stringent level. And in that, it depends on how you structure your irrevocable trust, and there are many variations of them.
Can you show slide 26 again?
Sure.
So people can take a quick look at that. Maybe you could spend a minute talking about that.
Of course. So here is the considerations created by Prop 19. So you have the two boxes that are in orange are the questions that you should ask yourself. Hey, is my property tax proportionately low as compared to the fair market value of my property today? Like, how much am I saving in property taxes today? Is that like, how much is that? Is that a lot? Is that a little? What's the, and does Prop 19 dramatically impact me if I were to not do anything? And then the next question you want to ask yourself is, what are my goals for this property? Like, who do I want to receive this property, and how do I want them to receive it? If I do nothing and give it to my child or whoever else it may be, you may forego the property tax reassessment, depending upon whether or not they move into the property. And also, but you do preserve the property, the step up in basis. However, if you go via a gift, you before February 16th, 2021, then you can preserve the property tax at what it is today, and then but you forego the step up in basis. Now, finally, for the entities and the irrevocable trust, the entities, as I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit more complicated, and we truly have to talk through this in terms of how you can structure it and move an asset into an entity. But there are ways that could be very beneficial depending upon the property profile to move a property into an entity. And with the entity, you could potentially continue to maintain financial interests, continue to maintain a lot of control over the property, but start passing things off a little bit earlier to your kids. And finally, with the irrevocable trust, there is the ability potentially to preserve property tax and step-up in basis, but you relinquish a lot of your control and a lot of your financial interest. This one here, again, it's a more complicated solution. And I'd say that it all depends on whether or not you'd be comfortable giving up your direct income from these properties.
There's a question from someone that is pretty general that can apply to a lot of folks.
Sure.
Can you clarify how this will affect those in living trusts for primary and rental properties? For example, if the parents gift a percentage of the primary resident to the child prior to 215, will that trigger a tax reassessment? That is, if the title to the deed will go from sole ownership parents to tenancy in common, meaning parents to multiple adult children. Then for rental property, if the title deed is to be transferred to the adult children, will the property be reassessed? I think the main question is, if I do a transfer prior to February 15th, will my property get reassessed? What do I need to do?
All right, so it all depends on that situation, on who it's going to. If it's parent to children, it depends on that property. If it's your primary residence, then there would not be a reassessment if you do it before February 16th. Now, if you do it after February 16th, then it depends on how the child takes ownership of the property, if they move into it or not as a primary residence. Now, for to answer the other property or the income property, if you were to transfer income property before Prop 19 comes into place, you have the ability to transfer up to $1 million of assessed value to your kids. Now, if you transfer a percentage, hey, it depends on that percentage that you're transferring over. If it's a $10 million property and you transfer, that's assessed at $10 million, and you transfer 20%, well, that additional $1 million would be assessed in terms of its value. Now, fractional distribution of properties could work to help preserve some portions of step-up in basis and some portions of property tax. But I would have to get a better understanding as to, I'd recommend looking at the property's profile and determining what the impact, the numerical impact is in terms of why you'd want to transfer a percentage versus transferring 50% or 100%.
I think this is a very important question. A lot of people may not know what stepped up basis is, because it'll determine whether or not you should do something or not do something, because you're looking at stepped up basis. Can you talk about stepped up basis again and give another example?
Of course. So a step up in basis is tied to capital gains. Now, capital gains is the difference between your the sale or the current value in the property, or the sale price when you sell the property, or minus what's known as the adjusted basis. And the adjusted basis, how you calculate that, you look at what you initially bought the property at, which is your cost basis, plus any type of capital improvements that you made into the property, minus any type of depreciation. And so for the example, if you had a property worth today $10 million and you bought it at $100,000, and you made improvements of like $900,000. So in total, your adjusted basis would be $1 million unless you had any depreciation, which you'd subtract out of it. So that adjusted basis of $1 million and is worth $10 million. If you sold your property, you'd have a potential gain of capital gain of $9 million that you'd be potentially susceptible to tax liability. What the step up in basis does is that if you do not sell that property, but instead you pass away, and and one inherits that property from you, that $9 million of capital gains, well, the adjusted basis would go from $1 million to whatever the fair market value is the date that the date that that transfer occurs. So if the person were to pass and they did not and they were to pass off their property to their children, and that property is worth $10 million, that property would receive an adjusted basis from $1 million to the $10 million, the date that that person passed. And if the children were to sell on that date, or sometime in the future, so long as the property is worth $10 million, if they sell it, they'd have $0 in tax liability for the capital gains. So in summary, capital gains and the step up in basis could be a very big reason why you do not want to transfer the property before February 16th, because the earnings that you could save from this, from passing it off to your kids via inheritance, you may save a lot more that way versus passing it off too early and just preserving the lower property tax.
Do we have any other questions? We could probably take a couple more.
Hi, I just have a quick clarification on the gift. If so this is a primary property that's owned by the parent, and if a percentage is gifted versus the entire property to the child of this primary property prior to February 16th, will that trigger a tax reassessment? I think you had mentioned the transfer. I just want to make sure it applies to also if the transfer is not the full deed, it's just a percentage of the property going from sole ownership to tenancy in common.
Sure, that there shouldn't be a, if it's going from parent to child, that's, there would not be, the exclusion would apply no matter if it's a full property, 100%, 5%, whatever it may be. There would be no reassessment there. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Aaron.
Sure.
Hi, Aaron. I have a question. Under the irrevocable trust, you have a bullet point for relinquish control. What can you expand on that, please?
Of course. So when one owns property today, they can do anything with it. They can encumber the property, they can sell the property, they can lease it, they can pretty much do anything with it. They can refinance it and so forth. They can pull money from it to be able to pay for another house for their kids or something. They could, and so forth. When you move it into an irrevocable trust, depending upon how you structure it, you may have to relinquish a lot of these rights because you're effectively moving it out of your control into another entity's control. And the way that that's structured, the way that that entity is structured, will have a direct impact on what you can do with that property. Now, a lot of the, I think there's a bit of noise going on here, but depending upon how you structure your irrevocable trust, like usually for irrevocable trust, you cannot have a financial benefit in it. So let's say if you're living off of 100K of income, property rental income, and you want to preserve the property tax and get it to your kids in this irrevocable trust, well, unfortunately, that income could no longer go to you anymore. In that sense, it could be directed to your kids, it could be directed to the trust itself, but it could not go to you. And on the other end, in terms of potential refinancing, and being able to pull money out of the property, hey, that part goes with it as well. There are control mechanisms to be able to pull it back into your estate, but once you do, there would most likely be a triggering of property tax reassessment, and from there, or a change in ownership and then property tax reassessment. So it all depends on the situation, and it can be very complicated to administer, and even then, it's a tough It's a tough solution, but it's possible, but it's very, very tough to maintain.
Aaron, can you go to slide 28 so people have your contact information?
Sure.
We'll take another question and then we'll wrap up, okay?
Sure.
If rents go up after kids assume inherit the property, guess what the tenants will leave? There's rent control in certain areas in California. If it goes from sole owners hip to tenants in common and hold until parents pass away and the 4 siblings become the remaining owners, what would be triggered at that point?
Okay.
Guess what happens if there's multiple kids and one kid moves in and the others don't? Are they all required to move in? Is there any clarification on that?
There's no clarification on the state level as to what would happen in that situation. The state has not given any indication as to whether or not it's one sibling that has to move in or all 4. Now, I will say how you leave the assets to your children does matter as well. If you leave it to all 4 and only one moves in, there's a potential, and let's say 1 out of the 4 wants to buy the others out, well, there would be that there could be property tax reassessments at those different stages when the siblings were to buy each other out. So that is some.
So in your example, if there were 4 siblings and one person moved in, it's possible that the 75% would go to market rate for property taxes.
Yeah, there's a possibility. We'd have to see what the Board of Equalization states. We haven't heard any indication as to whether or not it would be or not. Yeah, but it also depends on if it's the primary residence of the parents.
Someone says, does my kid have to live there for the rest of their life, or is there a time frame that they have to live there?
There's no indication from the Board of Equalization for that. It could be a year, it could be 6 months, could be 10 years. The law is not clear there.
Well, I think I want to thank Aaron for his time and Andy. Andy will be doing the Cantonese session. Victoria will be hosting the next session. If you guys need detailed information about your specific case, I would highly recommend that you contact Aaron or Andy to talk about your specific scenario. I'm sure there's probably a consultation fee or something, but
Yeah.
You know, it's worth spending a little bit of money to figure out whether or not it makes sense for you to do something now or do nothing. So there's no perfect solution. You either keep property tax or you lose stepped up basis. So thank you, everyone. Aaron is located in San Francisco. They're in San Francisco Peninsula. So if you guys can set something up with him directly, we're here really to provide information so that you guys are educated and know what you guys should potentially do. So thank you so much for all of your time. And if you have further questions, please email or set up a consultation with Aaron and Andy, who are lawyers.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. And we will be heading on over to the Cantonese session. Enjoy, have a happy week, and you guys don't have much time to take care of Prop 19 issues. I want to remind everyone that February 16th is President's Day weekend. So you pretty much need to do everything before February 12th in order, if you're planning on doing something, in order for this to be effective. It has to be recorded before then. And there's a huge rush of people doing recordings right now. So good luck, everyone. Thank you for coming. Okay, time for the Cantonese session. If you guys want to remain for the Cantonese session, feel free. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janice, and thank you everybody for having me. Take care.
Thanks, Aaron. So the Cantonese session is at 5 o'clock. So if you guys, here's a link again. So if you guys need to go to the Cantonese session, please go to that link. 如果你哋要聽廣東話咧，喺個右手邊喺個 chat 嗰度咧寫咗嗰個Zoom link，嗰個係另外一個 link。Thank you，bye bye everyone，去另外個 link 啦。